Hi class, welcome to lecture 4, part A. Today we're going to be talking about American political parties. So on the first slide here, I define parties. We're going to skip past that. It's pretty self-explanatory and the main functions of political parties. Read over that by yourself, but it's pretty self-explanatory. Let's go all the way to here, some important terminology. Kind of what I want to get out at this lecture is the difference between a partisan and a bipartisan individual. Partisan individual is someone who views issues strictly from the position of their party affiliate. So someone who votes true Republican every time, or someone who votes true Democrat every time. They're not willing to meet in the middle, really. They're not willing to negotiate and kind of realize that maybe everything isn't black and white. There's a gray area. On the other hand, someone who's bipartisan is someone who is willing to cooperate with the opposing political party, even though they ideologically might oppose each other. So they're willing to kind of meet in the middle to get things done. And I think you would all agree with me when I say that political partisanship is perhaps at an all-time high. And political scientists do measure this stuff. And we've seen it grow and grow and grow and grow really in the last 60 or 70 years. And as a result, it's become increasingly rare and increasingly difficult for Republicans and Democrats to actually work together. I mean, can you think of a lot of bipartisan members of Congress today? Not a lot come to mind. You know, the late John McCain was sometimes considered to be bipartisan in that he was willing to work with the other party, Democratic Party, to get things done. But he was really perhaps a dying breed. So as a result, again, we're seeing much more resentment, I would say, between Republicans and Democrats that maybe peaked during the Trump administration. So you might be wondering, why are the only two parties that win elections Republicans and Democrats? That's largely because we have a two-party system. That would be a system in which there are two relatively competitive parties who compete to win elections. And we've really had a two-party system since almost the formation of our country, since really the 1830s, about 50, 60 years after the formation of our country. And we've had a Democrat or Republican in the office of the president since 1860. Bonus points if you can determine who was president in 1860. It was a hint, it was the first Republican president ever. And that was Abraham Lincoln, 1860. So since Lincoln, a Republican or Democrat has won the presidential office in every election. So perhaps surprisingly, the two-party system is not actually a requirement of the Constitution. Nowhere does it say in the Constitution only two parties can compete for or win office. And in fact, many other countries, many other democratic countries have what we call multi-party systems in which more than two parties exist. So why then do the Republicans or Democrats always win elections? Why do we have this two-party system? It's a result of two things. First, the winner-take-all system, and second, single-member voting districts. So let's go over both of those, and they're pretty self-explanatory. In a winner-take-all system, whichever candidate gets the most votes wins that election. So let's look at, for example, the United States Senate elections, right? Every state gets two senators. Whoever wins the majority of the vote in that state wins the election. Okay, so let's say you have candidate A and candidate B, and each candidate wants a seat in California for the Senate. If candidate A gets 51% of the vote and candidate B gets 49% of the vote, candidate A wins, candidate B gets nothing. That's winner take all. No matter how close you are, you get nothing. It's not proportional. Winners win, losers are done. That's a winner take all system. And I'll show you an alternative to that system in a couple slides. The second reason we have two-party systems is because we have single-member voting districts, meaning we vote one member per district to Congress. So think of the House of Representatives. How it works is each state gets a certain amount based on population, and then one person represents that district. So in California, we have 53 House of Representative districts, and we elect one person per district. That is what we call a single-member voting district. And in that district, it's winner take all. So whoever gets the most amount of votes wins. The loser, no matter how close, they lose, they're done. So we have a winner take all system and a single member voting district and single member voting districts. Okay. Now, there is an alternative system that we see in many other democratic systems in different countries. and that is called proportional representation. And this is a lot to think about. A lot of people advocate for this in the United States, so I want you to have a firm understanding of it. A proportional system is when congressional or legislative seats are distributed based upon the number of votes received in an election. It's not winner take all. Let me explain further. So in a proportional system, whatever percent of the national vote you get that percentage of seats in Congress. So it's not a winner take all runoff, right? It's not like the United States where you win or you lose. You have a national vote, and whatever percentage of the vote nationally your political party gets, you get that percent of congressional seats. So for example, let's say let's say we have proportional representation in the United States. The Democratic Party got 50% of the vote, the Republican Party got 45% of the vote, and the Green Party got 5% of the national vote. Again, we're not voting for people necessarily, we're voting for the party. In that example, Democrats will get 50% of congressional seats, Republicans would get 45% of congressional seats, and the Green Party would get 5% of congressional seats. And this is, again, used in many countries. So it's very hard for a minor party like the Green Party or the Libertarian Party to win seats as it is, because they have to win in a direct election in a winner-take-all system. And it's very rare that a third party is going to get enough votes to win in that type of winner-take-all system, especially with single-member voting districts. But a proportional system, they can get 5% of the national vote. They might be a minority vote, but if they get that lower threshold, whatever it might be, 5%, let's say, they're getting congressional seats. So proportional system allows for multi-party systems to exist, allows for third parties to exist, as opposed to our system, which again is winner take all. So let's talk about some of the pros and cons of the proportional system, because again, a lot of people want this for the United States. It'd be very difficult to implement because of constitutional roadblocks, but it is worth thinking about. Some of the pros: marginalized groups receive representation. So if you belong to a political party that isn't very popular, but let's say you represent 5% of the total United States constituency, you would get 5% of congressional seats. So in that way, it can help marginalized groups to feel represented and third parties to feel represented. And perhaps the biggest pro of having a proportional system is you don't have to settle for one of the two major parties. I mean, how many of you feel like the Republican Party or the Democratic Party perfectly represents every single one of your beliefs? Probably not many of you. It's certainly not me. In a proportional system, you can vote for a smaller party that fits your belief system better, and you don't have to compromise as much. What are some of the cons of a proportional system? Because there are negatives too. It can create a system where perhaps too many political parties arise, which makes Congress a mess, right? So generally in a multi-party system, you have to make coalitions with their party to get any legislation passed. But if there's 20 parties in Congress, you have to make a lot of coalitions to get anything moved through Congress, and that can stall legislation, make it very slow. So I would say that's a negative. Also, maybe the biggest negative, excuse me, in a proportional system, let's say you only need 2% of the national vote to get a congressional seat, you can get some really radical or far out or weird parties that can gain seats. I mean, let's look at an example that I don't think is that extreme. I mean, what percentage of the US population do you think is racist? I mean, it's got to be at least a couple percent, maybe, at least maybe 5, 10, 15%, who knows, right? So you might start to get radicalized white supremacy type groups who have enough of the national vote to actually get seats in Congress. And that's problematic. No one wants, some neo-Nazi party, some extremely far right, or even extremely far left party gaining seats in a country like the United States. That'd be very bad. So there are pros and cons to the proportional system. Definitely something to think about. Okay, so let's talk about the two major parties very briefly. We'll go over them more later, but very briefly kind of talk about what they stand for. And we'll also talk about the biggest minor third party as well. So Republicans generally coincide with conservative ideology. We know this. They're generally fans of smaller government, which means lower taxes, less social programs, less regulation of business. They think the economy should be regulated by supply and demand. And when the government kind of intervenes itself, it only prohibits success in business. Republicans tend to also, again, be conservative, so they tend to emphasize traditional family values. The main Republican support base tends to be, these are the voters they consistently get: religious folk Christians, Southern white individuals, Rocky Mountain West whites. That sounds like a really bad band. Corporations, because of the lower corporate tax rate, rural voters outside of cities, conservatives, and those who make higher amounts of money because of lower tax rates. Democrats generally have liberal ideologies, not always, but generally. They believe in generally a bigger government with more taxes and leading to more social programs, more redistribution of wealth, tend to emphasize more minority rights and protections and more regulation of business. Whereas their main support base, generally people of color, Latinos, African Americans, Jews, secular members of the population, those who don't follow a faith. Unions are big with Democrats in certain geographical areas as well. So I'm going to skip this, but if you're curious, here are some of the older political parties that existed before the political system was dominated by Republicans and Democrats. You don't need to know this, but just in case you find it interesting. So what I have here is the 2016 electoral map. And of course, which Joe Biden, I'm sorry, this is the 2020 electoral map, not 16, I'm living in the past, in which obviously Joe Biden won. But what's interesting you'll notice is that even though a Democrat won, Democrats are represented by blue on here, Republicans are represented by red. Even though a Democrat won, most states were voted Republican. So that tends to be true. There are more Republican states, but they tend to be less populated. And there's less Democratic states, but they tend to be large populated centers, major cities. So they get more electoral votes. So if you look at like California, you get 54 electoral votes for winning the state, as opposed to a red state like North and South Dakota, you only get the minimum, which is 3 electoral votes. Here's another interesting map that I love, and I'm sorry it's from 2012. I couldn't find a more recent one. This is from the 2012 election, in which President Obama won, and it's by district, and you can see that even in Democratic states, they tend to be majority red. So geographically, we're a very Republican state, but high population areas tend to be Democratic, which evens things out and sometimes tips the scale. So I mean, California is a very Democratic state, but basically half the state geographically is almost Republican. But if you look at the blue areas, they're all the populous cities, San Francisco, Los Angeles, et cetera. If you look down here at the map, you see one little red dot and a sea of blue. Guess where that is? That is Orange County, which now traditionally votes Republican, but might be slipping the other way. Okay, so I mentioned there's minor third parties. There's a ton of them. It's difficult for minor parties because elections are very expensive. In 2016, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump both spent about $1 billion in the election. And it's hard for those small parties to find funding. Also, they might not be included on the ballot. They might not meet the threshold in any given state. And while there is federal funding for elections, it's often not enough to win the election, and you don't get reimbursed until after, making it very difficult for minor parties to succeed. Here's an example of some minor parties. The Libertarian's the biggest. We'll talk about that. You have the Green Party. There's still a Communist Party. There's a Marijuana Party. Some of you might like that. Believe it or not, there's a Pirate Party. It's not as cool as it sounds. It's more for, I believe, like digital piracy. But when I got all excited when I saw it, I looked it up. It wasn't as cool as you think. But anyone can create a party. It doesn't mean you're going to be successful, especially in our two-party system. But there are a lot of options out there. Okay, to close up our section A of this lecture, lecture 4, let's talk about the biggest third party, the Libertarians. Libertarians are kind of a cross between Republicans and Democrats. They want smallest government as possible. So socially, they're liberal, and fiscally, they're conservative. They want low taxes, not a lot of government regulation in business, which are Republican tenets. And they also want you to be able to marry whoever you want, be able to smoke weed, and whatever socially you want to do, which tend to be Democratic tenets. They kind of combine those, and they're probably the most consistent party, honestly. They want a little amount of government as possible. So just to sum it up, they're pro-choice, pro-gay marriage, anti-gun control, anti-large social programs, and anti-large taxes. So pretty unique party. That's going to conclude our part A of this lecture. Please tune in to part B, which I will post soon.